I want to welcome you on behalf of the Diversity Committee from our school. I'm currently chairing the committee, and we've put together a diversity webinar series for 2020. And today is our 7th webinar of the 8-part series. We have one more in November. And our presenters are sharing content around diverse topics, which align with the goals of inclusive excellence and diversity, equity, inclusion, which really are tied into our mission of the school as well as our college and our university. You will be able to find a full list of past presentations as well as the upcoming one on our website, and I will share with you the upcoming webcast link as well as the on-demand page where you can locate prior recordings. We do also have a YouTube playlist dedicated to the diversity series, and I will share that link in a moment in chat, and our podcasts. So several ways in which you can access these wonderful presentations afterwards. Tawana Hodge, she is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Librarian at the University of Florida, George A. Smathers Libraries. And she's presenting today on integrating cultural humility into librarianship. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Tawana.
Thank you, Michelle. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So it is a pleasure to be speaking to you all here today. I appreciate Michelle for doing a call for presenters and kind of accepting me to present on this topic. I first started learning about cultural humility over 5 years ago when I was a diversity resident librarian at the University of Utah, and learning with this alongside Lorelei Rutledge and Alfred Maldu, who I credit for being a part of the foundation for learning about this. And so I just want to acknowledge that it is National Hispanic Heritage Month. This kind of goes beyond just, acknowledging months or a celebration or awareness month, but to understand the contributions that those who are Hispanic or Latinx provide to this country and around the world as well. And that, supporting people and celebrating them goes beyond a month, a day, or a year. Also want to acknowledge that it's National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and this is actually the same year that ADA, the American Disability Act, actually turns 30, and so there's a lot to acknowledge and to celebrate in this regards, and wanting to make sure that people with disabilities, whether it's physical or psychological, that they are able to bring their full selves to work. So session objectives is that you'll learn about the concept of cultural humility, the difference between cultural competency and cultural humility, why should we integrate this into librarianship, as well as several recommendations and how to do so. Okay, so these are just some kind of conversation guidelines to help, flow with the session here today. So respect, listening, using I statements, I think, I feel, not co-opting the experiences of someone else, feeling honored and present, acknowledging that there's a lot of things that's ongoing, thinking about COVID-19, the fact, civil unrest and other things of that nature. And so very happy that you are here with us here today. And so continuing to be engaged with us. The right to disagree, understanding that, there's conflict of opinions. And there are degrees to disagreements that is going to touch on that a little bit more. The right to risk or to pass, because I will be engaging with you all. And so I'm not going to be the sage on the stage type thing. I'm going to be asking you all questions and really wanting to engage with you all, especially in the chat box. And feel free to utilize the Q&A feature to ask me hard questions, challenging questions, questions that makes me pause and think. I'm assuming that you have good intentions because you're here today, staying open to the process, leaning into your discomfort, making space for others, and taking space for taking up space where space traditionally have not been made for folks, and that this is a color-based space. So if you identify as BIPOC, I want you to feel empowered to share your perspectives, to add comments, to ask questions. And this is from Deborah Daniels, University of Utah's Women Resource Center. And then next up are brave space agreements. I initially learned about this through the ACRL virtual event. The keynote was Mackenzie Mack, and I fell in love with these, and I've been using them ever since, which has been a few months since then. And so created by Mackenzie Mack, but inspired by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. So the brave space agreements are: we agree to struggle against racism, sexism, transphobia, classism, sexism, and ableism, and the ways we internalize myths and misinformation about our own identities and identities of other people. We know that no space can be completely safe, and we agree to work together towards harm reduction, centering those most affected by injustice in a room, even if it means centering ourselves. We agree to sit with the discomfort that comes with having conversations about race, gender, identity, the nonprofit industrial complex, etc. We agree to try our best not to shame ourselves for the vulnerability that these kinds of conversations require. We agree to value the viewpoints of other people that do not challenge a conflict with our right to exist or challenge a conflict with another's right to exist. We agree that it's okay to have feelings. It's okay to feel uncomfortable when we are discussing complex topics about boundaries, accountability, personal relationships, organizational relationships, justice, and care. And so if you agree, I would like for you, and if you have access to the chat box, to type in "I agree," that you agree with these brave space agreements. And as we have this conversation and learn more about cultural humility and other topics here today, that you abide by these agreements. So I'm going to give people a few seconds to type in "I agree" if you agree with the brave space agreements.
And Tawana, I'm just going to hop in because I don't know if you can see the chat, but we are getting lots of "I agrees," majority, actually all "I agrees" thus far.
Okay, that is great because I don't have access to the chat. So thank you everyone for agreeing to the brave space agreements. And so Michelle had talked about the progressive stacking, and so I'm just going to briefly reiterate it again in terms of if you identify as part of our marginalized group or underrepresented group, especially if you're BIPOC, to use an asterisk at the start of your question or comment, and then it gets routed to the top. So feel free to do that. We acknowledge that you have to self-identify, but progressive stacking is a way to give underrepresented voices the chance to speak first. Okay, so I just want to briefly do a breathing exercise, and this is something that I've kind of adopted from one of the people I admire. Amanda Leftwich, she's a founder of Mindfulness in LAS, and just taking the moment to take a few deep breaths. Center around your body. Are you being present? And being present. What is your body telling you? What are you feeling? And just kind of sitting with that for like a few seconds. And it's just a way for us to calm down. After we've probably been going since 7, 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. And that we have the opportunity to just sit and breathe for a moment. Thank you. All right, so ALA Code of Ethics. So most people have probably seen the ALA Code of Ethics. You're probably thinking about, why do I bring this up? And this has been a core part of any cultural humility presentation that I do. Because, this is our guide to ethical decision-making, kind of a framework for dealing with situations involving ethical conflicts. And so one of this is just, we provide the highest level of service to all library users, and so we essentially saying that anyone that comes through our doors, okay, that we serve them, and we serve them through appropriate and usefully organized resources, equitable service policies, equitable access, and accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses to all requests. And this is something that we say that we strive to do day in and day out. But one of the things, and I would want you all to chime in the chat box, when can you think about times where we haven't, provided the highest level of service to all library users, where we seem to be erring on the side of inequitable service policies or inequitable access, that, how we respond to requests can be biased at times. What are some examples that you can think of? And this is not just true with libraries, but if you are outside of libraries, think about the things that you do and the policies and procedures that we may uphold that are not, serving everyone.
So there have been a couple comments. So ebook access, programming, Library of Congress subject headings that are biased or old terminology.
Yeah. And those are just some examples of many that we can think of. And that's not to comfort from a deficient way of thinking. Libraries, the goal of libraries providing access to information for all. This is not a neutral or something that is objective. This is something that, we are, libraries are very passionate about. Library workers are very passionate about and has given so much to this, but also acknowledging that libraries are a reflection of the societies that we live in. And so we have taken on some of the negative biases. We've taken on some of, racist, sexist, phobic systems and structures. And, we strive to move beyond that, which is a great thing.
Okay, prioritizing security of things over inclusivity, such as creating barriers to people by, for example, requiring IDs to use the archives or special collections, making assumptions about tech access, saying, quote, text us when you arrive, quote, for curbside pickup, for example. Mm-hmm. Really with COVID, there's a lot of discussion here about shifting in-person programs to online. Libraries currently opening, but only allowing access to students that our university serves and not the public, though we have traditionally been a public library. Continue to support expensive subscription access publishing models that have been known behind a gate, or keep knowledge behind the gate, I should say. Needing an address to sign up for a library card, police presence, partners for security, library fines, another great example. And then strict limits on which community members can't enter or use the library even before COVID. So again, that aspect. And there's several others. Forcing users to sign up for a card when they can choose not to. Intimidating for their address when they might be or could be homeless. And also library website, maybe mostly in English. So there's little to no visibility of, say, world language resources.
And those are a lot of really great examples of some of the ways that gatekeeping occurs. And the thing is that for some of these, it's intentional and some of them are unintentional. They're just a byproduct of not really diving deeper into the changing demographics of our communities, And in regards to what happened earlier this summer, that are still affecting us before, during, and still now, with the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Arbery Ahmaud, and the slew of people who I frame it as most of America and other people globally acknowledging that racism is still a thing, and that a lot of statements came out of that. And an understanding that for people of color in this country, their how they operate, their lifestyles are vastly different than whites or Caucasian folks worldwide, but particularly in America. And it's not to say that, we are, you know, essentially saying, white people are the root of all of this. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that as a Black woman, I live and navigate this world, particularly in this country, a little differently. And so there was just a number of different statements that came out and acknowledging, racism and anti-Black racism that exists, you know. For those of you who may know, may not know, the librarianship profession is 86% white. Even with the inclusion of the ARA Kaleidoscope program, which was formerly known, I believe it was initiative to recruit a diverse workforce, as well as the Spectrums program. And if you're a Spectrum scholar, feel free to shout out in the chat box. But, people, they've recruited, particularly people of color, into the profession almost at the same time that people of color are leaving, And so really thinking about what is our retention policies and things of that nature. And San Jose State University, which is libraries, which is an academic and research library, and even thinking about how the focus, a core commitment of values influence the things that we do, that for ACRL, acknowledge and address historical racial inequities, challenge oppressive systems. And a lot of that is for us to start thinking about, what do we know about the communities that we serve? What do we know about the history? In what ways have we have had gaps, and how are we correcting those gaps? And that all of these different statements, means that we have not been doing this on a mainstream level previously. And there's been articles that's been written about how even in libraries, though we fight for democracy, there's a way that we end up promoting whiteness, and wherein everything that is not white is other, and getting at that, and getting at what does it mean if somebody who's undocumented looks at our catalog, our library catalog, and see the use of illegal aliens, and this is referring to the documentary Change the Subject, which I would suggest that people watch if you're unfamiliar with it. And then thinking about vocational awe, and Favazi's article, amazing article that was written over 2 years ago. And if you're not familiar with it, I strongly suggest that you read it. But for this article, basically asking us to think about, we think of librarianship as being inherently good, sacred notions, and therefore beyond critique. And for us to be able to take a look at ourselves, to reflect and to critique, which are a part of cultural humility. Yes, I will post the name of the documentary into the chat box. And so culture is our way of living. It is complex, it is dynamic, continually evolving, constantly in flux by our experiences, by the people that come into this country, the people that live here, people who were born and raised here, people who immigrate here. It's always in flux. And the food and the language and the things that we cherish, But there's also isms and phobias. So racism, sexism, classism, sizeism, ableism, ethnocentrism, anti-Semitism, ageism, and phobias such as homophobia, Islamophobia, xenophobia, and transphobia. If there's any that I might be missing, feel free to add them to the chat box. But a question to you all, have you all experienced these in terms of people who've been sexist or racist or classist or elitist, in terms of academic institutions, there's that difference between if you're affiliated with the institution versus not, sizeism, ableism, even thinking about ableism and those with invisible disability versus a physical disability. What has been your experiences like? Um, what have you had to fight for?
And Tawana, I'll just jump in real quick about the documentaries that changed the subject. Is that the one you're referring to?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so just so everybody knows, I'll put it in the chat. Change the Subject is being aired on PBS for free through December. So I'm going to put the link into the chat for all of you. And there were just a few additional comments I want to add here. Someone mentioned earlier about creating programming centered only on white clientele when the community is changing, and adding a collection in different language is not enough, so everyone should be represented equally, as well as continuing to support library publishers and vendors who do not comply with current accessibility standards, so even considering accessibility. And you're asking about isms, rankism, particularly within academic institutions, sizeism, so feeling like there's something that is overlooked a lot, sizeism.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the other two that came up.
Thank you. Thank you for contributing, you all. And I will make sure to update this slide to include the things that you all have added from the chat box. And so I'm going to go through these next few slides a little quickly because I think at this point everyone knows what implicit bias is, and kind of understanding that they're pervasive, they're separate and distinct from implicit biases and beliefs in most cases, and they take consistent long-term effort to minimize your bias response. And from this article from Andrews, Kim, and Watanabe, Culture, Humility as Transformative Framework for Librarians, Tutors, and Youth, just kind of some examples, of, people might feel uncomfortable, they have varying levels of conflict with cultures outside of their own. Sometimes, people have a tendency to declare a patron's or a student name is too difficult to pronounce or spell, and so they give them maybe an English sounding name or they give them a nickname. I can't tell you how many times I've had my name misspelled, even by Zoom. It defaults to not my correct spelling name. Failing to support boisterous patrons, students or young adults. I may not feel comfortable telling them to, maybe quiet down. Have a tendency to maybe call the cops. Making assumptions about the home life or the culture of the patron. We have a tendency to leap to those assumptions. We have these automatic associations that occur from the media, from previous experiences that allow us to kind of make those associations, those assumptions, and being able to relate to diverse life experiences. So there's this implicit association test that exists, and it's just a way to kind of try to figure out what our implicit biases may be. There's been a lot of debate and conversation about the validity of it and things of that nature. I'm not here to tell you you must take it or anything like that. This is just one of several ways of trying to get at what our implicit biases might be, and our biases impact. They may not always kind of lead to an action necessarily. It might just be things that we think or perceive of others. But when we engage with other people, these associations have a tendency to control us, whether we're conscious of them or not. There are privilege checklists that exist. So these are just a few. And to just, quickly read from one from each. From the thin privilege checklist. I can go home from meetings, classes, and conversations and not feel excluded, fearful, attacked, isolated, outnumbered, unheard, or afraid at a distance because of the size of my body. I can worry about, this is from the white privilege checklist. I can worry about racism without being seen as a self-interested or self-seeking. And from the able privilege checklist, parts of your body or extensions of your body are not referred to as that thing. And so now, what I want to do is for you all to briefly do this activity. And so I am going to put the link into the chat box for you all. And so what it is that I want you all to do is to, using this wheel, identifying, the privilege that you have, whether it's language, gender, age. You could write down for age if you're young, middle age, if you're older. And on the line, essentially, you're going to write down, well, not write down, but you could, if you wanted to, but you can just mentally just state, where do you think, if it's closer to the middle, your identity have more privilege. If it's closer to the edge, it has less privilege. And then thinking about, and then part of the activity that I want a few people to share in the chat box is to identify 3 salient identities that means the most to you, that is important to you, and kind of list why. And so let me bring up the chat box and give you guys this link. So I will give you all a minute or two to do it, to work on this, but essentially you're going to kind of look at this and for this activity to identify 3 identities that are important to you, because what is important to you is not always important to, what's important to you is not always what other people ascribe to you or want to talk to you about, essentially, or deem that should be important to you. And so I'm just going to give you a minute to do this. And as you think about this, I'm just going to go through the next few slides. But I really do want a few brave participants, volunteers, to just put in the chat box what your 3 important identities are and why. Okay. Okay. So some bias reducing strategies, and you all will have access to this PowerPoint presentation. And like I said, feel free to add questions into the chat box. So stereotype replacement is, recognizing a stereotype has been activated. Think about why, and then, you actively substitute a non-stereotypical thought. Counter-stereotypic imaging is imagining an individual situation that counteracts your stereotype. People might assume that women are bad drivers, and envisioning that, a woman is a NASCAR driver, things of that nature. Another one is positive context. So this is, I think, something that libraries do particularly well, is positive context, increasing opportunities for positive context with members of a stereotyped group. So I see this happening in academic and public libraries and other libraries as well. So I'm going to stop right there and see if there was any folks who added anything to the chat box.
No responses yet, but again, this is completely voluntary. And if you'd like to share, and what was it, 3 identities as well as why you chose them?
Yeah, from the wheel. And so if you, say that age, education, or race, and race if you're Black, kind of really thinking about what are the things that's most important to you. Because I think a lot of times we don't have the opportunity to stop and reflect and think about what are all my identities, and being able to call them out. And so community support is being able to find organizations, associations, and groups that support or aids in your different identities, so that you can find, like, say, a therapist, you can find grocery stores that sell food that you're familiar with, that you grew up eating, that you're able to find religious support in your community. And so, things that can culturally validate you. Thank you for that question, Laura. And so Francis put in the chat box, education, religion, and age, that they shape how they think about the world, and that they change. And that's the thing, is that our identities and what our selling identities might change over time, and so for us to be able to acknowledge that, and some of them are social constructs that power and meaning have been infused, into them. And so thank you all for sharing. And so onto the thing that you all was probably itching to get at. So cultural humility. Cultural humility incorporates a lifelong commitment. So this is not something you, can decide that I'm just going to do it for like 2 seconds and then that's it. And this is self-evaluation and self-critique. And it's not critiquing to say that it's in a deficient way of thinking or anything like that. Is to acknowledge that we can't possibly know everything that there is to know about a particular group and their culture. And a question I will pose to you all: how would you describe American culture? And so feel free to put in the chat box, how would you describe American culture, particularly to someone who did not grow up in America, was not born and raised here. And so as people are populating the chat box, I'm just going to continue with this definition. And it's redressing the power imbalances. And in this particular, this is coming from the medical field in regards to the patient-physician dynamic and developing mutually beneficial and non-paternalistic partnerships. It is being other-oriented or person or patron-centered. It is honoring who that person is and what they bring. Okay, is engaging in constant and consistent self-reflection. And that self-reflection and that reflection piece can be in isolation, or it can be with a group of people who you trust, who have the ability to call you in and call you out depending on what is needed. Is expressing respect and a lack of superiority, even when cultural differences are present. And so it's not kind of falling into that trap of ethnocentrism, of believing that one culture is superior to another, or, one perspective or lifestyle is superior to another. But I'm going to stop right there and see if there was any folks who responded to the question: how would you describe American culture, especially to someone who was not born or raised here?
I think everyone's really excited and engaged with the identity exercise. So I don't know that we've moved to that question, but it's been great, the engagement and the sharing here. So thank you, everyone. Yes,
thank you. Let me see if I can see the chat box. Okay, yes, now I can see the chat box. Yes, thank you so much for sharing, and just scrolling up and just looking at some of this, because when we think about it, like the identities that we hold, they have a culture to them, a set of norms and mannerisms and language, and how we talk to certain people, how we don't talk to certain people, and who we engage to, whether we pray in the morning or not, or take Sundays off or not, or how we dress. Things of that nature. And so, and understanding that, for me, I was born and raised in St. Thomas, which is an island, I like to say, in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, 32 square miles. I'm American by birthright citizenship. But I did not grow up in the mainland, and so that's very different from the Black people that I've met who was born and raised here. And though we are Black, I consider myself Afro-Caribbean, my experiences are vastly different. and even within BIPOC and even within folks who are melanated, their experiences are not all the same, you know. And there's sometimes this expectation that, all BIPOC people know all BIPOC people and have the similar experiences. Not exactly, no. And so if people are putting in, in terms of like, how would they describe American culture? And, some people are saying American exceptionalism, very xenophobic and hateful at times, consumerism heavy, you know, self-worth through consumeristic ideals and different stuff like that. And people are saying similar things, people are saying different things. And so really understanding that depending on who you are and where you were born, which I wouldn't say timeline, which generation you were born into, the movements, that kind of influences how people perceive and experience the world. And so, thinking about that. And so for me, cultural competency, which has been something that has been integrated in so many disciplines. And there was even a class I had in graduate school that talked about cultural competency. The challenge with cultural competency, I think, is that there's people who believe that we can be competent in a culture, in ours and other people's, excuse me, that there is a set of characteristics or criteria that you can read this book chapter and not really understand, Native Americans and, their relationship with the healthcare system and different stuff like that. And to acknowledge that, one, there's no, and for somebody to say that competency that we do this one thing, we get this stamp of approval, we're competent. We don't need any ongoing training or education on this. And it also, to me, puts the onus on that person from that culture to educate us, to educate me on your culture. And the flip side with cultural humility, or maybe cultural humility is kind of on the spectrum, which is kind of a moving point or the next step, is that cultural humility is, for us, taking on the onus of educating ourselves about different communities that we're working and engaging with. And so for cultural humility, it can empower a stronger sense of pride in one culture, that you don't have to make excuses or provide disclaimers or anything like that, acknowledging and feeling a sense of, like they say, pride, and encouraging, people to respect one another's culture. And not, somebody mentioned that, a melting pot. A melting pot is essentially that you're losing aspects of yourself and you're assimilating into someone else's culture. And that's not what we mean. And I think, that libraries have an opportunity to dismantle dominant stereotypical narratives, because we're in the business of collecting information from everyone's perspective, and making sure that we are working with those communities that we are collecting from, and we acknowledging that our previous practices have been questionable at best, extremely traumatizing, and problematic at worst, but acknowledging that and working on restorative justice and reconciliation in different aspects. And that self-reflection is realistic and ongoing, self-appraisal, it's mindfulness, it's taking the time. We're so busy. And I think sometimes, there's that pridefulness in being busy. But we're so busy that we, a tendency, and we have so much that puts on us that you're doing 4 people's job at once, that we're unable to take the time to be mindful. That would allow us to check our power imbalances and challenge assumptions. Understanding that this is sustained commitment. And it's like when you're exercising, you haven't done it for a while, and you're trying to get your body to to do this. And so you're not trying to do everything at once, but you're starting off in bits and pieces that are sustainable. This is active engagement. It's not passive. Somebody is not watching this presentation or the other things, or diving into the other resources is not going to mean that, you're just consuming it and you're not doing anything with it. And that this is lifelong. There's no checklist. There's no stopping point. You're not going to get a handout that's like, this is step 1, and then this is step 50. If you do this, then this happens. That's that's the beauty of cultural humility, to me. Be humble. And so this is a model. Be humble about the assumptions you make, about knowing the world from your patrons or colleagues' shoes. This is not always patron-centered or focused. Understand how your own background can impact the care or the service that you provide for your patrons. Motivate to learn more about other people's background and culture. For me, it feels like we shouldn't have to wait until bodies drop, until lives are lost, until people feel that they are dehumanized in order for us to do the necessary work to learn about others. And as you learn and understanding, about different perspectives, begin incorporating this into how you understand people and engage with them. That this is lifelong learning, and emphasize respect, and really just genuinely listening to people. So we're going to stop right there and see if there's any questions or comments before I move on.
Tawana, I have a comment I want to mention here. So I teach a new course at San Jose, Cultural Competence for Information Professionals. And the way I've really described cultural competence is that it's a journey. And it's ongoing. It's not you go through these steps and you're proficient. So I think it ties in with it's lifelong learning, but it's also an engagement process. It may change. You might, take 10 steps back and then maybe 10 steps forward, but it's not really linear in the sense that it is an ongoing journey. And I really like how you describe how cultural humility is different in the spectrum and how it fits in. It fits in with cultural competency, and really the self-awareness, the biases, understanding your own values and value orientations. So I appreciate this piece, and I'm going to ensure my students listen to this if they're not here today, because it directly relates to the course I'm teaching. And I even think I will modify it and add just a specific module on cultural humility. So thank you.
You're welcome. And there are pros and cons. There's pros and cons with anything. And I think with cultural competency, there's a lot of things to be taken from it, and to be embedded and to be utilized. And there's an article that's out there that talks about like the combination of competency and humility. I can't remember the exact term because it legitimately combined it. But I'll find that article and send it to you, Michelle. But yeah, and so it's essentially thinking about, that humility aspect of being, for me, for those who ever worked, virtual chat or reference desk before, somebody comes up, or even, you get that ding and you don't know what they're going to ask. You don't know if you're going to be able to answer it. And taking some level of comfort in that, and knowing that you're going to be conducting that reference interview, you're going to be asking those questions, and even being conscious about the questions we ask and how some of those questions we ask can reinforce assumptions, and may end up making the person uncomfortable to even reveal some more,
And Tawana, there is a question that's come into the chat, if you might want to address it now.
I see it.
In the Q&A, I'm sorry, it's not in the chat.
What are the best ways to deal with personal biases to you? I find that it is important to library workers to understand other cultures, and that because of seniority, learning about other people's culture does not seem to be important to their work anymore. How must a large library system make sure that this is a priority and this is important? To answer your first question, I think once you understand what your biases are, I think really looking at like the bias reducing strategies, is one way to learn how to reduce your bias response. I think is being able to engage in that self-reflection. Is having people you trust, like in different settings, who are willing to call you out. And literally, when I say call you out, I mean like call you out, and, willing to take that time to teach you, what might have been, or call you out, or call you in, but to kind of help you think about maybe there's another way that this could have been said, or even thinking about our moments of silence. And in terms of prioritization from those who are in senior or administrative and leadership positions, I think for me, I always connect it back to what is the mission, vision, and strategic plan. If it has anything in there about providing a welcoming, inclusive community, how can we do that if we don't generally know what our community and understand how our biases can potentially, and most of the time, to impact how we design programming, the services that we provide people? How are we making sure that we are getting critical feedback? How are we keeping ourselves accountable, to these things that we said that we are doing? At my university, after in their acknowledging racism, their 15-point plan, they talked a lot about, focusing on Black experience for 2021 and different stuff like that. And there's been a number of statements that came out from different organizations, and for me, it's following up with them. If they don't make it a priority, and if it's not important to them, then what is? If it's not serving their community in a way that everyone feels welcome and invited and feel like they belong, then what else is more important? And I frame it that way because we are in the business of supporting people, including our colleagues, including our patrons. So we have to be able to understand what their lived experiences are, and making sure that they do not feel like they are perpetual strangers, or that they are othered in this country, that they have every right to be considered a human being and have basic human dignity and respect. So, honey, hopefully that I've answered your question. Aaron, you're interested in ways other libraries have engaged their cultural communities to find out the resources, program, and support that they want from their library. So I think that it could be a question to folks in the who are participating and who are here. So feel free to chime in and answer that question. I think for me, in my job, I've been here for 8 months. I haven't had the opportunity to systematically dive into the community, but I've embraced the opportunities of meeting with other people, and letting them connect me to others, that relationship building, that trust, but acknowledging that libraries from a lot of underserved and underrepresented communities, that libraries may not be seen as a place that they trust because it's an institution. And at times, libraries have not been for the people. And so it's acknowledging that historical and intergenerational trauma, acknowledging that there is trust that has been eroded to the point that it doesn't exist anymore. And it's really figuring out the history, what has happened, what is still happening. And it's not just the job of like a community engagement person or department, it's everyone's job. Because when somebody comes into the library, for the general public or for any student, faculty, or staff, they're not going to understand the person from the front desk, from an AD, essentially. And so it's getting everyone to understand that part of their job is working to learn about their communities. Oh gosh, I have 8 minutes left. So Erin, hopefully I've answered your question. And I think that there are other people who might respond to this question, but I think it's a great question. Okay. Engaging in reflective practice. I won't hammer this any further, but guiding questions for critical reflection. So in what ways do I consider my patrons' unique circumstances? Do I lump them together and base my interaction on previous experiences with members from their cultural groups? In what ways are unit library, so like your unit or department or library, state, national, international organization, association policies enact racism, classism, sexism, and other power relations. So taking it into these policies and procedures that we, uphold, and thinking about, are they reinforcing the particular perspectives and people that we serve? What are my own cultural experiences? How do they shape my practice? And so openness, reflective practice, journaling. I used to not be a really great journaler, but even if it's just jotting down a few thoughts, and it's carving time out of your day, whether it's in the beginning, middle, or end, to engage in this reflective practice, which journaling can help you with. And so kind of getting closer to the end of my presentation, because I really do want other people to ask me a lot more questions and to challenge me. I'm always excited about that. So things for the trainings and other stuff that we do. Using non-dominant first-person perspective. So really thinking about, if you're a professor, who's in your syllabus. And it goes beyond just like adding, citing Black women or, citing people of color and things of that nature. Is really looking at, like, do you have a statement that encourages encouraging discussion on controversial, uncomfortable topics, because I'll get to that a little bit later. Using lived experience. There's people who privilege credentials over lived experience, and to me, one should not be privileged over the other. When I used to teach instruction sessions, I used to use the example that, you could have somebody who has a PhD in molecular engineering, and if they're writing about or have a blog about taking care of 4C here, and they are a white woman, then and they don't have 4C here, then that's someone you're not going to want to utilize either for styling or if you're doing research into Black women who have 4C here. Encourage groups to explain their reasoning. Use examples that reverse common stereotypes, and discuss race, social class, and privilege. And there's been information about how the demographics of higher ed is changing, the demographics of this nation is changing, and making sure that we are being proactive and not reactive. And so, with COVID-19, acknowledging that community involvement might be incredibly difficult, especially since a lot of you all mentioned about in order to use library, you have to be, especially an academic library, you have to be affiliated in some way, shape, or form. But I think, providing the opportunity for the community to be involved in different steps of the way and for them to be co-creators in some of the things that we do. Providing opportunities for positive encounters, which is what this is part of and which this is doing. And question how your biases may affect the services you provide at your library. And remembering that learning happens through discomfort. Areas of growth for ourselves, some key takeaways, and is engaging in these conversations. I have a ton of resources. That is what I'm really good at. My references. And Kimberly Crenshaw, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is known as the founder of intersectionality. If we can't see a problem, we can't fix a problem. And so, any other questions? And then this is my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tawana. I took like 2 pages of notes. So this is really informative for me and in my courses and what I'm doing and to support students. And so if there are any questions, we have about 3 minutes, but if there is a question, if you can go ahead and put it in the Q&A, and we'll let Tawana address those. And yes, someone asked about the resources, citations. You will get a copy. I won't say you will get a copy. On our website, we will post the recording as well as a PDF of the presentation and any other resources that Tawana would like to share.
Yes, and I can stay on for maybe another 5 to 10 minutes if there's any pressing questions. And like I said, I want you all to question and challenge critical thinking. Things that you heard me talk about or state. You all are most welcome. I enjoy sharing the gospel. Let me stop. Sharing information about culture and humility, and there's so much more to learn. Every time I do this, I learn a little bit more myself, and through engaging with you all. And so I'm really excited, and I see some familiar people who are in attendance and, new folks. So thank you. Thank you for coming. And you don't have to struggle in this alone. This is not like an isolated activity. I don't want you to think that you have to enclose yourself into a dark space by yourself and work on this. It's forming a community, and it's taking time to weave this into your practice. And when I learned about this, 5 years ago, it was a struggle for me too. And I'm still learning different ways to, employ this, but also even, mentally checking myself, be like, why do I think this way? Tawana, why are you responding in this manner? And forcing me to kind of even think about things before I say them, and sometimes we think that these things end in just kind of whether we decide to do something. It's also when we don't decide to do something, when we decide not to say hi to someone or look them in the face, or to even just acknowledge their existence, and there's times where sometimes that's just what people want, is just to know that you see them as a human being and you treat them as such, and they don't have to fight for basic human dignity and respect.
Tawana, you just made me think about reflection and taking the space and the time to reflect on, if a situation does occur, or actually every interaction we have, but taking that time to really reflect on your own reactions or your own behaviors, and, maybe what went right, what went wrong, what you could do better, how we can each improve while we're on this journey, as I call it. Mm-hmm. So I think the reflection practice is a great tool, we'll say, yes, to really help you to inform, and also to, retool yourself if you need to, if something does occur.
Yeah. Yes, this is lifelong. We are works in progress. Mm-hmm. To not put additional pressure on ourselves to be like, I need to be here. Mm-hmm. I've said this before, it's not about just seeing the right thing. It's about doing the right thing. That action piece that I think a lot of people are clamoring for, in this moment. And I appreciate everyone who came. This has been great. I've enjoyed this so much. And please, my contact information is there. Reach out to me if you have any additional questions. If you want to provide feedback, did I talk too quickly? Did I say I'm just joking.
You did great. You're fabulous. I so appreciate you and your time, your expertise, and the value you're bringing to those that are here today, but also those that listen to this later. It's invaluable. You can't put a price on it. So I really appreciate you. Yes, I don't even know what to say, but I don't see any other questions. So thank you again. I see tons of thank yous. And yes, very important to support each other and for our communities. Any final thoughts before I close this out?
Well, we're all in this together. And our liberation is tied to the liberation of others. And so I so appreciate everyone who's attended and who are continuing to do this work and involving others in this work as well. Thank you.
Fabulous. I think you wrapped it up beautifully. So I'm just going to close with that. And again, thank each of you for attending or listening to this, and to our wonderful speaker, Tawana, for being here today.
Thank
Take
you.
care and have a great day, everyone.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.